50%. And that number is not a suggestion, it is a warning, and it is the quiet conclusion that this entire conversation has been moving toward for years, whether people wanted to admit it or not. This video is about the next phase of taxation, not income tax, as people traditionally understand it, but behavior driven taxation aimed at extracting revenue from social patterns that governments no longer know how to fix. It is about why a proposed so called sin tax on OnlyFans earnings in Florida is not an isolated idea, not a joke, and not something that can be laughed off as political theater. It is about how collapsing relationships, declining marriage rates, and a shrinking male tax base have created a vacuum, and how the state always moves to fill a vacuum. Watch this to the end, because the real shock is not who is being taxed, but why they were chosen and why this model is likely to spread far beyond one state. What we are witnessing right now is not a moral debate, not a culture war talking point, and not a discussion about personal choices. It is a revenue problem. Governments do not wake up one day and randomly decide to target a specific industry unless there is a measurable financial incentive to do so. And when you strip away the emotional noise, the Florida proposal tells a very clear story. The proposal to impose a 50% tax on earnings from platforms like OnlyFans, framed as a sin tax meant to fund education and mental health initiatives, is being discussed because the traditional sources of taxable income are no longer performing the way they used to. That is the uncomfortable truth underneath the headlines. This is not about morality, it is about math. And the math has been trending in the same direction for a long time. Historically, governments have always used taxation as a corrective tool when behavior could not be changed through persuasion, messaging, or incentives. This is not new, and it is not controversial from a policy standpoint. Alcohol taxes were raised to discourage consumption while still capturing revenue. Tobacco taxes were increased repeatedly when public health campaigns alone did not reduce usage fast enough. Gambling was legalized and regulated not because governments suddenly approved of it morally, but because illegal gambling produced zero taxable revenue. When something exists at scale and cannot be eliminated, the state does not fight it forever. It absorbs it, regulates it, and taxes it. That is the pattern, and it has repeated across centuries and across cultures. The Al Capone example is often mentioned for a reason because it captures this principle perfectly. One of the most powerful and untouchable criminals in American history was not ultimately stopped because of violence or public outrage, but because the financial system provided a lever that law enforcement could pull. Taxation is one of the most efficient tools governments have because it does not require changing human behavior. It simply monetizes it. When people say that a 50% tax on OnlyFans earnings sounds extreme, they are missing the point. Extreme behavior shifts produce extreme fiscal responses, and the behavior shift that matters here is not explicit content itself, but the collapse of traditional economic participation among men. Men pay the overwhelming majority of net taxes. This is not a talking point. It is a structural reality tied to income distribution, work hours, job types, and career longevity. Men also historically anchored household formation, marriage, and child rearing, which in turn drove consumption, housing demand, long term employment stability, and predictable tax revenue. Married men work longer hours, pursue higher earning trajectories, and are more likely to remain attached to the labor force. That stability has been eroding, and with it, the tax base that governments quietly relied on for decades. At the same time, consumer spending patterns have shifted dramatically. Women now account for the vast majority of consumer purchases, not necessarily because they are earning more in aggregate than men, but because household structures have changed. Fewer marriages mean fewer pooled incomes. Fewer children mean fewer long term consumption commitments. And fewer stable partnerships mean more spending is fragmented, short term, and often debt based rather than income based. This creates volatility in tax receipts, which governments are not built to handle well. The critical piece that rarely gets discussed openly is that men who opt out of relationships also opt out of certain economic behaviors. When men stop dating, stop marrying, and stop having children, they do not simply redirect that money elsewhere at the same scale. They downshift, they work less, they consume less, they take fewer risks, they need less housing, they need fewer goods, they do not need to impress anyone. That is not a moral judgment, it is a behavioral observation. And when multiplied across millions of individuals, it has macroeconomic consequences. This is where the so called simp economy enters the picture. While traditional dating and relationship markets have collapsed or at least severely contracted, one segment has remained surprisingly resilient. Online, attention based platforms that allow transactional interaction without commitment have continued to generate revenue even as other social markets have failed. OnlyFans is the most visible example, but it is not unique in principle. It functions as a direct pipeline between isolated consumers and content sellers, with payments structured as discretionary spending rather than long term obligations. From the perspective of the state, this is an ideal target. The transactions are digital, traceable, centralized, and already partially regulated. Unlike informal arrangements or gray market activities, platforms like OnlyFans provide clean data, payment processing, and predictable revenue streams. This is why governments tolerated the adult entertainment industry for decades while aggressively policing informal alternatives. Once activity moves onto a platform with a camera, a payment processor, and a terms of service agreement, it becomes legible to the state. Legibility is the first step toward taxation. The Florida proposal did not emerge in a vacuum. It reflects a growing awareness that while traditional family formation has declined, this alternative economy has scaled rapidly. OnlyFans reportedly generates billions in gross revenue annually, but the distribution of that income is extremely uneven. A very small percentage of creators earn the majority of the money, while the median creator earns a modest amount that barely registers as a living wage. This matters because governments are not interested in fairness at the individual level. They are interested in aggregate revenue. A small number of high earners combined with a massive volume of transactions creates an attractive tax base. When critics say that such a tax would harm creators, they are again missing the underlying logic. Governments do not design tax policy around average outcomes, they design it around capture potential. A 50% tax does not need to be efficient or equitable to be implemented, it only needs to be enforceable. And enforceability is exactly what digital platforms provide. There is also a political dimension that cannot be ignored. Framing this as a sin tax allows policymakers to sidestep deeper structural questions. It shifts the conversation away from why young people are disengaging from traditional economic paths and toward a moralized debate about behavior. That framing is useful because it divides public opinion while still accomplishing the fiscal goal. Supporters can claim it funds social goods. Critics can argue about personal freedom. Meanwhile, the tax base is expanded. What makes this moment particularly volatile is that many young women now see platforms like OnlyFans as a legitimate career path. This is not because the average outcome is lucrative, but because visible outliers dominate the narrative. Just as social media amplified the perception that everyone could become an influencer, these platforms amplify rare success stories while obscuring median reality. That disconnect becomes dangerous when policy shifts occur because expectations collide with enforcement. At the same time, many men have fully disengaged not just from dating, but from social participation altogether. They are not protesting, they are not organizing, they are simply absent. That absence is deeply destabilizing for systems that were built on male productivity and predictability. When people say that society cannot function without men, this is not a slogan, it is a logistical statement. Infrastructure, revenue, and long term planning depend on consistent participation, and that participation is declining. The irony is that the simp economy exists precisely because traditional relationships have collapsed. It is not a replacement for partnership, it is a symptom of its absence. And symptoms are always easier to tax than causes. Governments cannot tax loneliness directly, they cannot tax disengagement, but they can tax the transactional behaviors that arise from them. As inflation rises, housing becomes less affordable and living expenses increase. Financial pressure intensifies across the board. Single income households struggle. Dual income households are rarer, and safety nets are stretched thin. In that environment, the state looks for revenue wherever it can find it, especially in sectors that appear to be growing despite broader contraction. OnlyFans and similar platforms stand out not because they are morally offensive, but because they are economically visible. What makes the backlash inevitable is the realization that once taxed, these platforms lose part of their appeal. Higher taxes mean lower take home income for creators and higher effective costs for consumers. That friction reduces volume over time. But from the state's perspective, even a shrinking pie can be preferable if it is newly taxable. This is the same logic applied to tobacco and alcohol. Consumption declined, but revenue persisted for decades. The deeper implication is that this is not the endpoint. If this tax model is implemented and proves enforceable, it will not remain confined to one platform or one state. Policymakers learn from each other. Revenue experiments spread quickly when they work. And once a behavior is categorized as taxable at a higher rate, it becomes easier to justify similar measures elsewhere. What we are really watching is the monetization of social breakdown. Instead of rebuilding the conditions that supported stable relationships, family formation, and long term productivity, the system is adapting to their absence. It is extracting value from fragmentation rather than cohesion. That is a profound shift, and it carries long term consequences that go far beyond one tax proposal. This is why the emotional reaction misses the point. Anger, outrage, and defensiveness do not change fiscal incentives. When governments face declining revenue from traditional sources, they will pursue alternatives. They always have. The only question is how far that pursuit will go and who will be left holding the bill when the experiment runs its course. At this stage, what matters is understanding the trajectory rather than debating the headline. A 50% tax is not a starting point. It is a signal that the system believes the old model is no longer recoverable. It suggests that policymakers are planning for a future where traditional economic anchors do not return, and where revenue must be extracted from whatever remains active. In that sense, this is not about women, men, or platforms in isolation. It is about a society attempting to fund itself in the absence of the structures that once made that funding effortless. And when those structures collapse, the the remaining participants inevitably become targets, not because they are at fault, but because they are still there. To understand where this is heading, you have to step back and look at how modern governments actually perceive society, because it is very different from how individuals experience it day to day. Governments do not see people as stories, struggles, or intentions. They see participation rates, revenue streams, compliance, and predictability. When a large segment of the population quietly withdraws from traditional life paths, that withdrawal does not register as a protest, it registers as a deficit. No press conference is held for missing tax receipts. No cultural debate is triggered when fewer hours are worked or fewer families are full-born. The system simply notices that expected inflows are not arriving, and it begins searching for substitutes. For decades, The core assumption baked into economic planning was that most men would eventually partner, form households, raise children, and anchor themselves to long term employment. That assumption shaped everything from housing policy to transportation infrastructure to pension planning. When those assumptions fail, the system does not pause to ask why in a philosophical sense, it recalculates. And recalculation often leads to pressure points that feel arbitrary to the people caught in them, but make perfect sense to those looking at spreadsheets. What makes the current moment so unusual is that the withdrawal is not driven by a single event. It is not a recession, not a war, not a temporary shock. It is a sustained behavioral shift. Men are opting out in quiet, non confrontational ways. They are not forming families. They are not pursuing promotions at the same rates. They are not consuming at previous levels. And most importantly for the state, they are not producing the same predictable taxable surplus. This is not a moral judgment, it is an accounting problem. In earlier eras, when male participation declined, it was often temporary. After wars, demobilization brought men back into civilian life. After recessions, recoveries pulled workers back into the labor force. The difference now is that the exit does not appear temporary. It is voluntary, decentralized, and largely invisible. You cannot regulate something you cannot see, and you cannot reverse a trend that has no centralized leadership or demands. That leaves taxation as the primary lever left. This is where the logic behind taxing the simp economy becomes clearer. It is one of the few remaining channels where money still flows from disengaged men into the broader system. Even men who have walked away from dating, relationships, and social obligations still participate here to some degree. The transaction is simple, limited, and emotionally contained. It does not require commitment, compromise, or long term risk. From a system perspective, it is one of the last bridges between withdrawn individuals and taxable activity. Governments did not create this economy, but they are very aware of it. They track it the same way they track streaming services, digital subscriptions, and online gaming. Anytime millions of small transactions occur regularly through centralized platforms, it becomes legible and therefore taxable. This is why informal economies are tolerated only up to a point. Once they scale, they either become regulated or suppressed. OnlyFans and similar platforms crossed that threshold years ago. The framing of this as a syntax is strategic. It allows policymakers to present the measure as corrective rather than extractive. Education and mental health funding are universally defensible goals. Linking a tax to those outcomes reduces resistance and reframes the debate away from structural failure. The public argument becomes about values instead of viability. That is not accidental, but there is a deeper tension here that is rarely discussed honestly. The same cultural forces that encouraged independence, autonomy, and detachment from traditional roles also reduced the stability that governments depended on. When women were told they no longer needed men, that message was interpreted literally. Men responded not with confrontation, but with compliance. They stepped aside, they disengaged. And now the system is discovering that independence at scale has financial consequences. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable because it exposes a contradiction. For decades, men were told to stop approaching, stop leading, stop expecting reciprocity, and stop centering their lives around relationships. That message was amplified across media, education, and corporate culture. When men internalized it and acted accordingly, the outcome was not liberation, it was fragmentation. And fragmentation is expensive. The rise of OnlyFans as a normalized option did not happen in isolation. It filled a void created by the collapse of trust and accessibility in traditional dating. When dating apps became hostile, performative, and low return for men, many simply stopped participating. That exit did not eliminate desire or curiosity. It redirected it into spaces with clearer rules and lower social risk. Transactional interaction replaced ambiguous pursuit. From the state's point of view, this redirection is both a problem and an opportunity. It is a problem because it does not produce families, children, or long term stability. It is an opportunity because it produces traceable revenue. The state cannot force people back into relationships, but it can tax the alternatives they choose. Critics often argue that such taxes unfairly target women, but that interpretation assumes the policy is about gender. It is not. It is about revenue density. The platform concentrates income flows in a way that makes enforcement simple. The state does not care who the sellers are. It cares that the activity is centralized, scalable, and persistent. That is why the tax is discussed at all. What is likely to catch many people off guard is how little resistance this type of policy encounters once implemented. History shows that once a tax is framed as funding a social good, opposition fragments quickly. Some support it on moral grounds. Others oppose it on personal freedom grounds. The debate becomes emotional and polarized, which paradoxically reduces the likelihood of coordinated pushback. Meanwhile, the policy proceeds. Another overlooked factor is that platforms themselves often comply readily. They already collect data. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. They already process payments. Adding an additional withholding mechanism is not technically difficult. Once a platform integrates tax collection, individual resistance becomes almost irrelevant. Compliance shifts upstream, away from creators and consumers, and into automated systems. This is why the idea that people will simply leave the platform en masse is unrealistic. Most will adapt, prices will adjust, earnings will compress. Some creators will exit, others will stay. The overall volume may decline, but the taxable base will remain. That is sufficient for the state's purposes. What makes this especially revealing is the contrast with how traditional relationships were treated. Marriage, family formation, and child rearing were incentivized indirectly through tax benefits, social norms, and stability. Those incentives weakened over time. Now, instead of rebuilding them, the system is taxing the absence they left behind. That is not restoration, it is adaptation. Men watching this unfold from a distance often feel detached, not because they approve or disapprove, but because they are no longer invested. When you step outside the system's expectations, its adjustments feel abstract. The tax is not aimed at them directly. Their reduced consumption means they are less exposed. They are not the ones building careers around platforms vulnerable to policy shifts. They are observers, not participants. This detachment is itself destabilizing. Societies rely on shared stakes. When large numbers of people no longer feel affected by policy outcomes, legitimacy erodes. But again, erosion is slow and quiet. It does not announce itself, it simply accumulates. Women who turned to platforms like OnlyFans often did so under financial pressure, rising costs, and limited alternatives. That reality matters, but it does not change how the system responds. Systems respond to scale, not intention. Once enough people rely on a channel for income, it becomes a node of control that is unavoidable in centralized economies. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the same voices that dismissed concerns about declining marriage and male disengagement are now surprised by the consequences. They assumed the system would adjust benignly. Instead, it is adjusting aggressively, not through persuasion, but through extraction. And extraction does not stop at one boundary. Once a revenue source is identified and normalized, it invites expansion. Additional fees, additional reporting requirements, additional classifications, each step justified as necessary, temporary, or targeted. Over time, the burden compounds. This is why the Florida proposal should be seen as a test case, not because it will pass exactly as written, but because it signals willingness to redefine personal income as behavioral income, willingness to treat attention based transactions as taxable indulgences, willingness to monetize social withdrawal rather than address its causes. There is also a generational aspect to this that cannot be ignored. Younger generations are less attached to traditional markers of success. They value flexibility, autonomy, and control. That makes them more comfortable with platform based income, but also more vulnerable to policy shifts that target those platforms. Stability once came from institutions. Now it comes from algorithms. Algorithms can change overnight. The state understands this better than most people realize. It does not need everyone to comply enthusiastically. It only needs the platforms to comply efficiently. Once that happens, the debate becomes largely symbolic. What is striking is how predictable this path is in hindsight. Declining family formation leads to declining tax stability. Declining tax stability leads to alternative revenue searches. Alternative revenue searches focus on visible centralized activity. Visible centralized activity gets reframed as indulgence. Indulgence gets taxed. The pattern is almost mechanical. Yet public discourse remains stuck at the surface level, arguing about fairness, morality, and intent. Those arguments matter emotionally, but they do not alter the trajectory. The trajectory is driven by numbers, not narratives. As this continues, more people will begin to notice that independence has a cost that was never fully disclosed. When individuals replace mutual reliance with transactional substitutes, the system eventually inserts itself into the transaction. That is not punishment, it is participation. Understanding this does not require outrage or panic, it requires clarity. Clarity about what systems prioritize, clarity about what happens when large groups opt out of traditional roles without building replacements that serve collective needs, and clarity about how power responds when stability is threatened. This is not the end of the conversation, it is the middle. The decisions being made now will shape how remaining forms of participation are treated in the years ahead. And those who believe this is isolated to one platform or one group are likely underestimating how adaptable and persistent fiscal logic can be. As the conversation moves forward, it becomes impossible to avoid the larger question that sits underneath everything discussed so far, which is what happens when a society no longer expects participation as a default condition. For most of modern history, participation was assumed. You worked, you formed relationships, you consumed, you paid taxes, and you moved through predictable stages of life. Policy, culture, and economics were all built around that assumption. When that assumption breaks, systems do not collapse immediately, they mutate. What we are watching now is not collapse, it is mutation. And mutation is often harder to recognize because it happens unevenly. The state does not need everyone to participate fully, it only needs enough participation to remain solvent. When traditional pathways fail to deliver that participation, the state pivots toward whatever remains active. This is why niche behaviors suddenly receive outsized attention. It is not because they are growing faster than everything else, but because everything else is shrinking. In relative terms, they stand out. In fiscal terms, they become targets. This is where many people misread the intent behind policies like the proposed OnlyFans tax. They assume it is about discouraging behavior. In reality, it is about pricing behavior. Discouragement is secondary. The primary goal is to ensure that money flowing through non traditional channels does not escape the tax net. Whether people stop, slow down, or continue is almost irrelevant. As long as some volume remains, the policy achieves its purpose. There is also a timing element that matters. Governments tend to move when multiple pressures converge. Rising debt, inflation, demographic decline, and workforce contraction are all happening simultaneously. Each one alone would be manageable. Together, they create urgency. Urgency compresses decision making. Ideas that would have seemed politically risky a decade ago now appear pragmatic. This is why the framing around education and mental health resonates. These are areas where costs are rising and outcomes are uncertain. Funding gaps are easy to justify. Attaching a new tax to these goals allows policymakers to present action without addressing root causes. It signals responsiveness while avoiding structural reform. That trade off is attractive in the short term, even if it creates long term distortion. The distortion becomes visible when you consider incentives. If the state begins to rely on revenue from transactional intimacy, it has no incentive to restore environments where intimacy forms organically. In fact, stability could reduce revenue. This is not a conspiracy, it is a byproduct of dependence. When systems grow accustomed to certain income streams, they protect them, consciously or not. This is one reason why rebuilding traditional social structures becomes increasingly unlikely once alternative economies reach scale. The feedback loop shifts. Instead of asking how to encourage long term relationships, policymakers ask how to regulate the substitutes. Over time, the substitute becomes normalized, taxed, and embedded. At that point, reversal becomes politically and fiscally costly. Men observing this process often feel a sense of distance that is difficult to articulate. It is not triumph, it is not resentment, it is detachment. When you remove yourself from a system's expectations, its internal adjustments no longer feel personal, they feel observational. That emotional distance is itself a form of withdrawal, and it reinforces the cycle. Women, on the other hand, are often closer to the impact because they are more visible within the targeted economy. Visibility brings vulnerability. When income is tied to platforms and platforms are tied to policy, personal agency narrows. Choices become constrained by rules set far away. That tension fuels anger, but anger does not change leverage. The irony is that many of the narratives that encouraged platform based independence framed it as freedom from oversight. In reality, platforms concentrate oversight. They simplify enforcement, they reduce friction for regulators. What feels like autonomy at the individual level often translates into control at the systemic level. Another factor that accelerates this process is normalization through comparison. Once one jurisdiction implements a policy, others observe the outcome. If revenue increases without significant backlash, imitation follows. This is how taxes spread, not through ideology, but through demonstration. Policymakers rarely want to be first, but they are quick to follow. The global dimension cannot be ignored either. Digital platforms do not respect borders, but tax authorities do. This creates pressure for harmonization. If one region taxes aggressively, others will seek to capture their share. Over time, what begins as a local proposal becomes part of a broader regulatory environment. Creators and consumers may attempt to move, but mobility is more limited than it appears. Payment processors, banks, and platforms impose constraints that align with regulatory expectations. This brings the conversation back to power. Power in modern societies is exercised less through force and more through infrastructure. Whoever controls the infrastructure controls the outcomes. Platforms are infrastructure. Payment systems are infrastructure. Tax codes are infrastructure. Individuals operate within these frameworks, whether they feel represented or not. The deeper consequence of all this is a shift in how value is defined. Traditional value came from production, stability, and continuity. Emerging value comes from attention, engagement, and immediacy. The state is adapting to this shift, but adaptation does not equal endorsement. It simply reflects survival instincts. As attention based economies grow, they become increasingly attractive targets because attention is measurable. Views, clicks, subscriptions, and tips all generate data. Data enables enforcement. Enforcement enables taxation. This chain is already well established in other sectors. The novelty here is not the mechanism, but the domain. What often goes unsaid is that once a behavior is taxed heavily, it is implicitly acknowledged as permanent. Governments do not tax temporary fads aggressively, they tax durable patterns. A 50% rate signals confidence that the activity will persist even under pressure. That confidence may or may not be justified, but it reveals the state's expectations. For individuals building lives around these platforms, that realization can be unsettling. It suggests that what was framed as optional or transitional is now being treated as structural. That shift changes how risk should be assessed. When income depends on something the state has classified as a sin or indulgence, volatility increases, rules can change quickly, rates can rise, exemptions can disappear. Meanwhile, the broader social fabric continues to thin. Fewer shared experiences, fewer mutual obligations, more isolated decision making. Systems designed for cohesion struggle to operate under fragmentation. The response, again, is not restoration but extraction. This is why focusing solely on who is being taxed misses the larger picture. The more important question is what is no longer being produced. Stable families, long term employment, predictable consumption, and intergenerational continuity once subsidized everything else. When those disappear, the cost does not vanish, it relocates. The relocation often feels unfair because it is uneven. Those who remain active bear more burden, those who disengage bear less. That asymmetry fuels resentment on all sides, but resentment is not actionable. The system does not respond to feelings, it responds to flows. As this continues, expect the language around responsibility to shift. Participation will be framed as civic duty in new ways. Consumption may be moralized. Earning through certain channels may be scrutinized. All of this serves to justify extraction without addressing why participation declined in the first place. The uncomfortable implication is that many of these outcomes were predictable. When social trust erodes and institutions lose legitimacy, people retreat into individual optimization. When enough people do that, collective systems strain. The system's response is not introspection, it is adjustment. That adjustment often feels cold because it is. It is not personal. It does not care who feels betrayed or validated. It only cares whether the numbers balance. As more people recognize this pattern, a quiet shift in mindset occurs. Instead of arguing about fairness, they begin planning around inevitability. They reduce exposure, they lower expectations, they disengage further. That secondary disengagement compounds the original problem. This feedback loop is difficult to interrupt because it lacks a clear villain. No single actor is responsible. Everyone is responding rationally within their own constraints. That is what makes it so persistent. In this environment, watching from the sidelines becomes increasingly common, not as an act of defiance, but as a form of self preservation. When systems feel unpredictable and extractive, minimizing interaction feels safer. That instinct may protect individuals, but it weakens collectives. This is the tension at the heart of the current moment: individual rationality versus collective viability. When too many choose the former, the latter falters. The state steps in to compensate, not by rebuilding trust, but by monetizing whatever remains. Understanding this does not require agreement or approval. It requires seeing the pattern clearly. Once you see it, the proposal in Florida stops feeling shocking and starts feeling inevitable. Not because it is good, but because it fits the logic of a system under strain. Once extraction becomes the default response to disengagement, the long term consequences begin to surface in ways that are subtle at first and undeniable later. Systems built on participation do not collapse when participation declines, they hollow out. They continue to function, but with diminishing returns, increasing strain, and growing reliance on fewer and fewer active nodes. That hollowing process explains why policies that would have seemed unthinkable a generation ago now arrive quietly, framed as reasonable adjustments rather than emergency measures. A hollow system does not announce itself as broken. Roads still exist, institutions still operate, elections still happen. But the underlying assumptions that once gave those structures stability no longer hold. Participation becomes selective rather than universal. Compliance becomes transactional rather than civic. Loyalty becomes conditional. This changes how power behaves. When participation is no longer guaranteed, power becomes more extractive and less persuasive. It no longer tries to inspire engagement, it prices disengagement. The proposal to heavily tax transactional intimacy is one expression of this shift, but it is not the only one. Similar logic can already be seen in rising fees, fines, surcharges, and indirect taxes across multiple sectors. These are not random, they are designed to capture revenue from behaviors that persist even as broader participation declines. The system adapts not by restoring trust, but by monetizing predictability wherever it can find it. Predictability is the key concept here. Marriage was predictable, family formation was predictable, long term employment was predictable. Those predictabilities allowed governments to plan decades ahead. When they vanish, the system turns toward micro predictabilities, monthly subscriptions, digital tips, platform fees. Anything that produces consistent, traceable cash flow becomes valuable, regardless of its social implications. This is why the moral framing of these taxes is almost irrelevant. Whether something is considered good or bad socially does not determine whether it will be taxed. What matters is whether it is measurable, centralized, and persistent. Transactional attention meets all three criteria. It is logged, intermediated, and recurring. From a fiscal perspective, it is ideal. As this reality sinks in, another pattern emerges. People begin to realize that independence within a system does not mean immunity from that system. Opting out of traditional roles does not remove you from governance, it simply changes how governance reaches you. Instead of incentives, you receive fees. Instead of benefits, you receive scrutiny. Instead of encouragement, you receive compliance requirements. This realization often triggers anger, but anger is misdirected if it focuses on the tax itself rather than the conditions that made it viable. The tax is a symptom. The cause is disengagement combined with centralization. When individuals withdraw from decentralized social structures and concentrate activity on platforms, they trade social complexity for administrative simplicity. That trade favors the system, not the individual. Men who have stepped back from participation often sense this intuitively. By reducing their footprint, they reduce exposure. Fewer transactions mean fewer touch points. Fewer touch points mean less extraction. This does not make them virtuous or malicious. It makes them strategically invisible. Invisibility becomes a form of insulation. That insulation is unevenly distributed. Those whose livelihoods depend on visibility cannot hide. Visibility is their asset and their vulnerability. Platforms reward exposure, but exposure invites regulation. This is the paradox at the heart of attention economies. The very thing that creates opportunity also creates control. As more people recognize this paradox, behavior adjusts again. Some will attempt to diversify income. Others will accept reduced margins. Some will exit entirely. The system anticipates this. It does not need everyone to stay. It only needs enough volume to justify enforcement. Attrition is expected and priced in. The broader social consequence of this dynamic is a normalization of transactional living. When long term bonds weaken, short term exchanges fill the gap. Those exchanges are easier to tax, easier to regulate, and easier to replace. They do not require trust, only terms of service. Over time, this reshapes expectations. People stop asking what society owes them and start asking what each interaction costs. This mindset shift has cascading effects. Civic engagement declines because it offers little immediate return. Voluntary contribution declines because obligation feels one sided. Community weakens because it lacks reciprocity. The system responds by professionalizing what was once informal. Paid services replace mutual aid. Regulation replaces trust. In that environment, the idea of rebuilding traditional structures becomes increasingly abstract. It is not that people oppose stability, it is that stability no longer feels accessible. The barriers are too high. The incentives are misaligned. The risk feels asymmetric. So people choose what feels manageable, even if it is suboptimal in the long run. Governments facing this reality prioritize solvency over cohesion. They cannot wait for cultural renewal. They need revenue now. That urgency drives experimentation. Some experiments will fail, others will stick. Those that stick become precedent. Precedent matters because it lowers resistance. Once a category is taxed, expanding the category becomes easier. Once a rate is accepted, increasing the rate becomes thinkable. Once enforcement mechanisms are in place, applying them elsewhere becomes efficient. This is how systems evolve incrementally without dramatic rupture. The danger is not any single policy, but the accumulation of many small adjustments that together change the character of society. When extraction replaces participation as the primary interface between individual and state, trust erodes further. That erosion feeds the cycle. Less trust leads to less engagement. Less engagement leads to more extraction. Breaking the cycle would require restoring conditions where participation feels rewarding rather than risky. That would mean addressing housing affordability, employment stability, relationship dynamics, and social legitimacy. Those are complex, slow moving challenges. Taxation is simple by comparison. Simplicity wins under pressure, but this is why watching policy debates alone is insufficient. The real story is behavioral, how people respond quietly, individually, without coordination. Those responses shape the future more than any headline. When millions make small adjustments in the same direction, systems feel it. One of the most overlooked consequences of this shift is generational disconnection. Younger individuals grow up in an environment where transactional norms dominate. They never experience the old predictabilities. Their baseline expectations are different. They assume volatility. They assume extraction. They plan accordingly. That planning often involves minimizing exposure, maximizing flexibility, and avoiding long term commitments. Ironically, these strategies make collective stability even harder to achieve. But from the individual perspective, they feel rational. This tension between individual optimization and collective fragility defines the current era. The state is not blind to this, but it is constrained. It cannot force optimism. It cannot legislate trust. It can only respond to what exists. What exists now is fragmentation combined with centralization. That combination produces the kind of policies we are seeing. Understanding this helps explain why emotional appeals fall flat. Outrage does not change incentives. Moral arguments do not rebalance budgets. The system moves according to pressures, not preferences. When enough pressure builds, movement follows. And for those watching from the sidelines, this can feel validating in a detached way. The predictions they made quietly are being confirmed. But validation does not equate to satisfaction. A system that adapts by extracting rather than rebuilding is not one that inspires loyalty, it invites further withdrawal. This is the quiet standoff forming beneath the surface, a system attempting to sustain itself through monetization of decline, and individuals attempting to preserve autonomy by reducing engagement. Neither side announces its intentions, both act incrementally. The outcome emerges slowly. As this continues, more areas of life will be reframed through the lens of revenue. Behaviors once considered private will be classified, measured, and priced, not because of malice, but because of necessity. The line between personal choice and taxable activity will blur further. The Florida proposal is one marker along this path. It is not the destination, it signals direction. Paying attention to direction matters more than debating any single stop along the way. For viewers trying to make sense of this moment, the key is to recognize patterns rather than fixate on personalities or politics. Governments change, parties rotate, incentives remain. When incentives align with extraction, policy follows. This does not mean there are no alternatives. It means alternatives require collective will, trust, and patience. Those are in short supply. Until they return, adaptation will continue along the path of least resistance. That path leads toward greater monetization of behavior, greater reliance on platforms, and greater distance between individuals and institutions. Whether that path is sustainable is an open question. What is clear is that it is the path currently being taken. And as continuity becomes the only promise systems are willing to make, people begin to recalibrate what continuity actually means in their own lives. Continuity no longer implies growth, security, or upward movement. It simply means that things will keep going in some form, even if that form feels thinner, more transactional, and less meaningful than what came before. This shift in expectations is subtle, but it is one of the most important changes underway because expectations shape behavior long before policy ever does. When people stop expecting stability, they stop building for the long term. They stop investing emotionally, socially, and economically in systems that no longer appear reciprocal. Instead, they hedge, they compartmentalize, they keep their options open. This is rational behavior in an uncertain environment, but it has cumulative effects. Systems designed around long term commitment struggle when most participants are operating on short time horizons. The state, facing this reality, increasingly treats citizens less like partners and more like revenue participants. Language shifts quietly. People become users, contributors, payers. Civic identity gives way to administrative identity. You're no longer primarily a member of a community, you are a node in a system. Nodes are valued for throughput, not loyalty. This is why taxation strategies increasingly resemble pricing models. Fees for use, premiums for access, penalties for non-compliance. All of these resemble market mechanisms more than civic obligations. The line between governance and service provision blurs. This is not accidental. It reflects a deeper transformation in how authority is exercised. In earlier eras, authority relied on legitimacy. Legitimacy was reinforced by shared narratives, mutual dependence, and long term trust. When those erode, authority compensates with efficiency. Efficiency does not require belief, only compliance. Compliance can be automated. Automation scales. This is the direction modern governance naturally drifts when social cohesion weakens. Platforms accelerate this drift because they already operate on similar principles. They optimize engagement, they monetize behavior, they enforce rules algorithmically. When governments interact with platforms, their logics align, data flows seamlessly, enforcement becomes frictionless. This convergence between platform logic and state logic is one of the defining features of the current moment. Individuals caught between these forces often feel an unease they struggle to name. It is not fear in the traditional sense. It is a sense that the ground rules have changed without a formal announcement. That obligations remain, but protections feel conditional. That participation is expected, but belonging is optional. This unease feeds into further withdrawal. People reduce visibility, they simplify lives, they avoid commitments that increase exposure, they choose predictability over possibility. None of this is dramatic, it is quiet, but quiet changes are often the most enduring. The taxation of transactional intimacy fits neatly into this pattern. It formalizes something that was previously informal. It converts personal exchange into fiscal category. Once categorized, it can be managed, audited, adjusted. What was once a workaround becomes an input. This process has a way of flattening distinctions. Nuance disappears. Individual circumstances are irrelevant. The system does not care why someone participates, only that they do. Compassion exists at the rhetorical level, not the operational one. Operations require standardization. As standardization spreads, creativity narrows. People adapt to rules rather than inventing new paths. Innovation becomes riskier because the margin for error shrinks. When the state claims a larger share of upside, downside becomes harder to absorb. This discourages experimentation and reinforces conformity. Over time, this produces a culture of cautious minimalism. Do only what is necessary, earn only what is required, expose only what cannot be avoided. This is not apathy. It is defensive rationality. It is what people do when systems feel extractive rather than supportive. Ironically, this defensive posture further undermines the system's goals. Reduced ambition means reduced output. Reduced output means reduced revenue. Reduced revenue triggers further extraction. The cycle tightens again. Breaking the cycle would require restoring a sense that participation yields more than it costs. That effort is rewarded rather than penalized. That visibility does not automatically invite burden, but restoring that belief requires trust. And trust cannot be mandated. It must be earned over time through consistent reciprocal behavior. At the moment, reciprocity feels scarce. Many people feel they are asked to give more while receiving less. That perception matters, even if it is debated statistically. Perception drives behavior more reliably than data. This is why public messaging struggles to gain traction. When lived experience contradicts official narratives, people disengage. They stop listening. They stop believing. They focus on what they can control. That control often lies outside formal systems. And the result is a kind of parallel existence, and people comply enough to avoid trouble, but they do not invest emotionally. They operate alongside the system rather than within it. This is sustainable for individuals, but corrosive for institutions. Institutions respond by tightening rules, increasing oversight, and expanding categories, each step justified as necessary. Each step further alienating those already distant. This feedback loop is not driven by malice, but by misalignment between institutional incentives and human psychology. As more of life becomes legible to the state and through digital mediation, the space for informal adjustment shrinks. There are fewer gray areas, fewer unmeasured interactions. Everything leaves a trail. Trails invite analysis. Analysis invites policy. This is up to the deeper significance of platform based economies. They do not just create new income streams, they restructure the relationship between individuals and authority. They turn behavior into data, data into leverage, leverage into revenue. Once that transformation occurs, Reversing it is extremely difficult. You cannot unsee data. You cannot untax what has been categorized. You cannot easily return to informality once formality is established. The arrow of administration points in one direction. For those who built expectations around flexibility and autonomy, this realization can feel like betrayal. But betrayal implies a promise was broken. In many cases, no explicit promise was ever made. Assumptions filled the gap. Assumptions are fragile. This is why younger generations appear cynical. Cynicism is often mistaken for pessimism, but it is more accurately a refusal to accept narratives without proof. When systems repeatedly fail to meet expectations, skepticism becomes adaptive. That skepticism shapes choices. It discourages long term bets. It favors liquidity over commitment. It values optionality above all else. These values clash with systems that depend on predictability and long term planning. The clash does not resolve through debate, it resolves through power. Power, in modern context, expresses itself through pricing, access, and regulation. Taxation is one of the most direct expressions of that power. Understanding this does not require agreement with any particular ideology. It requires recognizing how incentives operate when trust erodes. Systems optimize for survival. Individuals optimize for autonomy. When those optimizations conflict, friction increases. The Florida proposal is not an outlier. It is a visible instance of a broader adjustment. Similar logic will appear in other domains, perhaps less visibly at first. Fees for digital participation, levies on emerging income streams, increased scrutiny of non traditional work. Each instance will be debated in isolation. Each will have its own justification. Taken together, they form a pattern of adaptation through monetization rather than reconstruction. For observers, the challenge is to resist being distracted by surface arguments and instead track the underlying movement. Ask what behaviors are being priced. Ask why those behaviors persist. Ask what has disappeared that made them necessary. These questions lead back to participation. Not participation as obligation, but participation as mutual investment. Without that, systems become transactional, and transactions are taxable. The future shaped by this trajectory is not necessarily dystopian, but it is narrower. Fewer paths, clearer rules, higher costs for deviation, less room for organic social repair, more reliance on managed substitutes. People will adapt, as they always do. Adaptation does not mean endorsement, it means survival. But survival mode is not fertile ground for flourishing. As the series continues, the focus will increasingly shift toward what individuals can realistically do within these constraints, not in terms of protest or resistance, but in terms of positioning, how to navigate systems that are becoming more extractive without becoming consumed by them. That navigation begins with awareness. Awareness of how incentives shape policy, awareness of how visibility creates vulnerability, awareness of how disengagement and extraction reinforce each other. Clarity does not solve the problem, but it prevents confusion. Confusion keeps people reactive. Clarity allows deliberate choice. The era ahead will reward those who understand systems without becoming dependent on them, who engage selectively rather than reflexively, who build resilience outside formal structures while remaining compliant enough to avoid unnecessary friction. This is not a call to withdraw completely. Total withdrawal carries its own risks. It is a call to recalibrate expectations and strategies in light of how the environment is changing. The story unfolding now is not about a single tax, a single platform, or a single group. It is about how societies adapt when foundational assumptions fail. The adaptation underway prioritizes continuity over cohesion, revenue over restoration. Whether that path leads to long term stability or gradual fragmentation remains to be seen. What is clear is that the decisions being made now, quietly and incrementally, will shape the boundaries within which future choices are made. And those boundaries, once set, are rarely expanded again without significant disruption. As we arrive at the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that the most important takeaway is not outrage, prediction, or blame, but recognition. Recognition of how systems behave when long standing assumptions stop holding, recognition of how incentives quietly replace ideals, recognition of how withdrawal and extraction feed each other until the relationship between individuals and institutions becomes almost entirely transactional. The Florida proposal, and others like it that will inevitably follow, are not the result of sudden cultural hostility or moral awakening. They are responses to a long period of social disengagement that has reached a fiscal breaking point. When participation declines, systems do not ask who left first. They ask where the remaining activity is and how it can be captured. This is not cruelty, it is function. What makes this moment feel unsettling is that many people were encouraged to believe that opting out carried no systemic consequences, that independence was neutral, that walking away would only affect personal outcomes. In reality, large scale disengagement reshapes everything downstream. The system does not disappear when people step back. It recalibrates, and recalibration often means shifting burdens onto whatever remains visible and active. This is why emotional reactions, while understandable, are not especially useful. Anger at attacks does not address why the tax is possible. Debates about fairness do not restore the conditions that once made such measures unnecessary. What matters is understanding the feedback loop that brought us here and recognizing how easily it can tighten further. One of the most revealing aspects of this entire situation is how quiet it has been. There has been no dramatic announcement that society is changing course, no declaration that old models are finished. Instead, small adjustments appear one by one: a fee here, a surcharge there, a reclassification somewhere else. Each change feels manageable on its own. Together, they redraw the landscape, and people sense this even if they cannot articulate it. That is why so many are cautious, reserved, and hesitant to commit. They feel that the rules are in flux, and they are correct. When rules feel unstable, the rational response is to minimize exposure. That response, multiplied across millions, produces exactly the conditions that trigger further extraction. This does not mean individuals are wrong to protect themselves. It means the system and the people within it are now operating with fundamentally different assumptions. The system assumes continuity through monetization. Individuals assume survival through disengagement. Those assumptions collide quietly, without headlines. The irony is that both sides believe they are acting pragmatically. The state believes it is securing revenue to fund necessary services. Individuals believe they are reducing risk in an unpredictable environment. Both are responding logically to incentives. The conflict emerges not from intent, but from misalignment. And understanding this misalignment is crucial because it reframes the entire conversation. It shifts the focus away from morality and toward structure, toward incentives, toward long term consequences that cannot be solved with slogans or short term fixes. The question moving forward is not whether similar policies will appear elsewhere. They will. The question is whether societies can find ways to rebuild participation that feels mutually beneficial rather than extractive. That is a far harder task than passing a tax, and it requires trust that has been eroding for a long time. Trust cannot be restored through enforcement. It cannot be automated. It grows slowly through consistent reciprocity. through systems that reward contribution without punishing visibility, through structures that make long-term investment feel worthwhile again. Until that happens, adaptation will continue along the current path. More behaviors will be priced, more transactions will be categorized, more platforms will become extensions of regulatory infrastructure. This is not speculation, it is the logical continuation of trends already in motion. For those watching from a distance, the temptation is to feel detached, validated, or indifferent. But detachment has its limits. A society where fewer and fewer people feel invested in collective outcomes becomes brittle. It can continue for a long time, but it becomes less capable of renewal. At the same time, panic is unnecessary. Systems rarely collapse overnight, they persist, adjust, and evolve. The danger is not sudden breakdown, but gradual narrowing. Fewer options, higher costs, less room for organic recovery. That is why clarity matters more than emotion. Clarity allows people to make informed decisions about where to engage, where to step back, and where to avoid unnecessary exposure. It allows individuals to remain grounded even as structures shift. None of this requires despair. It requires realism. Realism about incentives, realism about trade offs, realism about the difference between personal autonomy and systemic insulation. As this series concludes, the most important thing to understand is that what is happening now did not begin with one proposal, one platform, or one group. It is the result of years of small decisions, cultural shifts, and institutional adaptations interacting with each other. The outcome feels sudden, only because the pieces were never discussed together. Seeing the full picture does not obligate agreement with any particular viewpoint. It simply allows you to navigate the environment with open eyes rather than reacting to each headline in isolation. Before I close this out, I want to give a shout out to the 1 hour gang, the people who stayed all the way to the end and actually engaged with these long form discussions rather than just skimming the surface. If you are enjoying these angry guy videos and you want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep these deep dives going. I also want to hear what you think about what we discussed. Do you agree with this direction? Do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your perspective because these conversations matter more when people actually talk about them. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.